Welcome to the Breakfast Leadership Show, where we interview global thought leaders on business, leadership, and life. Here's your host, keynote speaker, best-selling author, and chief burnout officer of the Breakfast Leadership Network, Michael Levitt.
Welcome back. I've got Victoria Pelletier on the line. How are you, Victoria?
I'm great. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great to have you here. Really looking forward to this conversation. So for those that aren't aware of what you do, why don't you share a little bit about you, and then we'll dive right into this conversation.
Sure, absolutely. So I describe myself as really a career-long B2B professional services executive, becoming COO at a crazy young age at 24 for a business process outsourcing or BPO company, and loved the dynamic and challenge in that world and stayed there ever since through a few different slices of it. I also am maniacally focused on healthy leadership and culture and diversity, equity, inclusion. And outside of my day job, I am a professional public speaker, wife, mom, fitness fanatic, foodie, and wine lover.
Lots to pick apart there, but we'll pick on the leadership side of things for a moment. And obviously we'll dive into the speaking as well, because with all of those interests and backgrounds, you've got a ton to be able to speak on and the expertise. But leadership is something that my company name's got the word leadership in it. So it's something that I am, very, very close to. And we're seeing, and especially during the pandemic, and if you want to call it post-pandemic or whatever we're calling it, ultimately, there's been a lot thrown at leaders. I'd be really curious to see your insights on where leaders have done well and where there's some improvement that could be done to help them be better leaders, obviously taking care of their health, which of course has a big impact on how they lead and other angles as well. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's evolved and changed over the last few years in terms of the expectations of leaders by employees in particular, and or should I say even what employees were willing to accept previously. I'm a big supporter of this, human-centered, heart-centered kind of leadership, which for me means things like being incredibly authentic. Sometimes that comes with being vulnerable, which was a hard lesson I learned. I was afraid to be vulnerable when I was this very early young leader, but being authentic, being vulnerable, being transparent to the extent that we can, and sharing insight around why we need to make the decisions we need to make as a leader in business. But it also is around creating really trusted, I'll use the word authentic again, connection and relationships with our team. And so I think COVID and the pandemic and, no separation anymore between work and home as we work out of our homes caused a lot of employees to sit and reflect on what they want. You use the word health, and I think a lot of that has to do with mental health. And so the phrase future of work's been thrown out there a lot. The reality is the future is here. And so again, the dynamic around what employees want in the kind of environment and the types of leaders, I think, has shifted. So for many leaders who've been uncomfortable with what that meant, they've had to learn and educate and get coaching themselves and pivot potentially where necessary.
And that's one area where, and I'm sure you probably agree with this, in many instances, managers and leaders had never really been trained on a lot of things. They were really good at what they did. They were promoted, but they never were really taught on how to be a manager or how to be a leader. So they just kind of approached it trial by fire, which in this new dynamic of hybrid, remote, in person, a mix thereof, and encountering employees that you used to say, okay, here, we're going to give you a big raise. And everybody's happy for a little bit, but now even people are going, it's not about the money. It's about something else. And I need a little bit more autonomy in how I work and what my work looks like and how I approach it. And I think that's been a steep learning curve for a lot of managers and leaders.
I'd agree. I think a lot of the focus is around impact that we want to have in the work that we do. And what I believe is incumbent upon leadership is to bring an connection to the work that people perform with how that brings impact, not just to the company in terms of revenue and profit, but those that you serve, so your customers or clients, what does that value bring? And so I think we all want that. And to your point, Michael, it's less about money for many and much more around meaning and connectedness to our values and the kind of impact we want to have in the work we do and potentially the communities we live in and the world more broadly.
It reminds me of a medical clinic that I took over a few years ago, and they were averaging almost 9 out of 10 people leaving every year because it was just a toxic place. And these are master's level and above clinicians that were just leaving. It wasn't, high school kids that, are going to do a different job. They were just like, they couldn't stand it anymore. So after my first year there, I reduced that turnover rate to 6%. And 1, I didn't give a single raise. 2, I did not increase their vacation time. There was no extra perks that were brought into the place. But what I did do was I listened. And I wanted to hear what they had to say and gave the question, if you were running this organization, what would you change? And basically stole all their ideas, and anything that made sense, I implemented it. And all of a sudden, everyone goes, wow, this person actually is listening to us. They're making improvements to make it better, and putting everybody in their quote unquote sweet spot of what they really love to do, and also spend money on professional development for additional skills that they wanted to learn more about, which then improved the patient care. We were able to expand the clinic and see more patients in a vulnerable area that didn't have access to a lot of care before. And all it was, I say it all it was, but it was just listening and creating an environment for people to shine and thrive. And when you do that, it's amazing what you can do. And again, I didn't give them a single dollar in salary increases, but they stayed, and that was years ago. And I occasionally will look back and see what's going on at that clinic. And majority of people that I brought on and or the people that were there when I came on board are still there. So it thrills me to see that the system is still plugging along, but it historically it hadn't been that way.
Agree. And I think we know that people leave leaders and subsequently will move for leaders as well. And so I think that's critically important and underestimated by many in business. And to your point, think it's just going to be about the dollars when it's clearly so much more than that.
Absolutely. So let's dive into your keynote speaking. What I'm sure with all your career going back to when you were 24 and, being a COO or whatever, I forget what the role was, but, obviously executive at a very young age. How did you segue from doing all of that important work to venturing out into the keynote world?
So I started speaking for my work. So when I shifted into, and you were right, it was COO for this, outsourcing organization, all of a sudden showing up at many more conferences and wanting to build the profile of the business, securing speaking spots on stage around the world of outsourcing and maybe some of the segments around it, and starting to talk on leadership. So I began my journey purely from a professional standpoint, speaking for the companies I worked for. And then I forayed into doing it at a personal, professional level for which I get paid when I started to do more and more work with the employee resource groups that I was working with within the companies I worked for. So speaking at, our International Women's Day event, for example. So I'm typically part of 2 of the ERG or BRG groups, employee or business resource groups within the workplaces I've worked for. Women. I've been a massive advocate for women in advancement and gender parity and all those sorts of things for many years. And then the other would be for our Pride or LGBT groups as well. And so as I started to speak to the team, the teams internally, a lot wanted to hear about my own career journey and my story. And what are the lessons my now 40-something-year-old self would have told the 20-something-year-old self. And so as I shared that, I actually started to realize I was doing a disservice by not being as, going back to the word authenticity and vulnerability, as I needed to be. And so I started to share more of my personal story, my why, if you will, in terms of what has driven me to be, as driven from a work perspective, but also this, focus around leadership and culture where I made mistakes, et cetera. And people started asking me to deliver the same talk over and over again to various different audiences. So then I started to monetize that and do it separately, to the point where when I joined the last company as an executive that I worked for, they have a rule that you're not supposed to earn income outside of your executive duties, other than passive income, obviously. And so I negotiated it into my contract. And I said, this is something I love to do, and I want to continue to do it with a great degree of ethics. Obviously, I will never charge if it's a client or an event that we're sponsoring, et cetera, et cetera. And so now I do a mix of it. My companies take full advantage of it and leverage me quite heavily. In fact, when I was working for IBM a number of years ago, LinkedIn ranked me as their number one social seller worldwide, given the strong brand I built and a lot of the speaking I did. And then I also get the opportunity to do it. And I talk a lot around doing things that bring me great joy personally or professionally. And this happens to be one of those things.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that question, but also kudos to you and the organization for allowing you to do this, because when you are a keynote speaker and you're out speaking to a variety of different audiences, we learn things. We get educated as well, whether it's if we happen to sit into a session, sometimes we do that, sometimes we don't, but just in interactions with people, we gain from them as well, which then in return improves the work that you do for your company. And they were smart. They're like, hey, wait a minute, we've got an all-star here, and we can leverage that to gain business growth and speak to audiences and all of that. And it's great because you said, I was going to ask you this question, of all the things you do, what's one thing that really resonates with you the most? If you could only do one thing, and I'm guessing the public speaking would be at the top of the list, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, it is. However, I've been asked whether I would want to make that full-time my career. And I don't actually, Michael. I enjoy I'm not fully in what they refer to as a portfolio career. That's kind of when I'm later at the end. My husband jokes I'm never going to retire. It's probably true. But the portfolio career will be a little bit of consulting, the board work that I do, and some public speaking. So I really enjoy my corporate executive role, the complexity that comes with that. And I enjoy speaking. I think if it was my full-time day job, I wouldn't enjoy it as much as I do now, having it as a portion of what I refer to as me being a multi-potentialite. I've got lots of diverse interests, and this is one of them that's at the forefront, and I really enjoy it. And I make time for capacity for the things for which I enjoy. And this is one of those.
You don't need to retire when you're having fun. And when you've built yourself a career where you can be creative in a variety of different ways and adjust the levers accordingly. Because if you're a full-time keynote speaker, then you're getting your fill of airports and all of that and travel in there. And when you're able to do the things you do with the board advisory roles or the consulting or the other things, it's using different quadrants of your brain, and that keeps your brain moving. So I think it would be very difficult, and I'm not trying to put words in anybody's minds or anything like that, but I think it would be difficult for you to do the classic retirement where you just stop working, because your body would like, what in the world is this? I mean, you can always say, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the advisory side of things and cut back the travel a little bit, but that's, up to you. But you've got a long career ahead of you. You're still in the early days. So and of course, as I, talk to you and know about you, you continue to evolve and you continue to try different things. And like, I'm going to do this. And even going back to, what you mentioned a few minutes ago about being an incredible advocate for women's leadership and pay equity and LGBTQ and all of those initiatives and diversity, all of these things that are so critically important for the work world. And you're out there doing that as well. So it's utilizing that leverage that you have and, being ranked number one and all those things. When you have that type of platform, then you've got the ability to make an impact in those areas where they definitely need some assistance to get the equity and access and diversity and inclusion and all these important things that make our companies better. It's And I shared this story before on my show. It's like when I first started working at a grocery store when I was 16, my bosses were all female and I didn't think anything of it. I'm like, okay, cool. Because my mom and my grandmother and my great grandmother all worked during their lives. So for me, I didn't really know anything. And then all of a sudden, I started learning about, okay, the pay, equity or lack thereof. And it was, talking to my parents and my mom and dad, shared with me as a teenager, okay, this is kind of what's going on in the world. I'm like, well, that's not right. And that was in the 80s. And here we are, 40 years later, or 30 or 40, scary to think about, but I try not to do that math. But ultimately we still have those problems and it bothers me to a core. It's like, why? The job is there. It doesn't matter what the gender is. It's about the skill set and what they bring to the table. And I'm thankful that, there are strong leaders like you out there that are pushing forward with this. And as somebody that has all daughters, I'm fully in supportive of it as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, the World Economic Forum did in their latest report said that pay parity at a gender level, we're still in North America 60 years away from achieving gender pay equity. And that's scary, as you said, seeing, in 30 or 40 years, whatever it is. And I too, I'm afraid to think back around my own age and going back all those years. And by the way, in other countries around the world, it's 100 plus years to achieve the same is just shocking to me. So that's just one data point. So when I see people who challenge, whether it's affirmative action or whether it's DE&I programs within businesses, I said, look, we have to be strategically intentional about how we're going to move the needle forward, because clearly the data shows we are very, very far away from having not only gender equity, pay equity, but broad diversity within our workforces and the equity and the inclusion piece that keeps people engaged and want to be there and really focused on the kind of going back to the value system that, in the companies we want to work for.
Yeah, it reminds me of that one clinic that I worked for that I turned around when I left. Staff was made of 16 different nations, and it just happened organically. It wasn't a case where I put out advertisements and saying, okay, I'd like to hire a registered nurse from Ghana. I didn't put that in the job description because one, it'd probably be illegal, and two, it was just wasn't there. But it was amazing to be able to see a microcosm of our planet in that clinic. It was just, and especially there were people that were from quote unquote warring countries working together. And it just gave me renewed hope in what can be possible, and all genders and races and everything else, all working at a collective good to provide amazing healthcare to a population that desperately need it. But it was so amazing. And it also helped with, patient care, because our neighborhoods were representative of different countries as well. So when you're a patient in your native language, let's say you're from Poland, for example, if your physician or nurse can speak the same language as you, it breaks down any confusion on what they need to do in order to improve their health. And it happened, thankfully, organically. And it wasn't a case where like, okay, I'm going to hire this race or this race. They were the best candidates. I didn't have to look at the demographics. They were the best candidates that applied for the roles. And I was so thankful to be able to do that organically. But for companies that can't do it, quote unquote, organically, you need to make it a really big focus on making it happen, because it makes your organization so much more richer, because you get different experiences and backgrounds and ways of looking at things, which again improves, the stability of the organization, and it actually makes it a whole lot better.
Yeah, I agree. And I often tell leaders that there does not need to be a trade-off for the business performance, most, often looked at from a financial standpoint, by doing the right thing around having a diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture. The reality is DE&I drives innovation, productivity, engagement, and therefore both the top and the bottom line results. So one is actually very good in driving business results, and it's not going to cost you by doing the right thing.
Exactly. So I've loved this conversation. Where can people find out more about you and all this amazing work you're doing?
Well, I have a website, which is victoria-pelletier.com, and people can choose from there to link out to connect with me on whatever social media platform of their choice, LinkedIn, Insta, Facebook, although as my youngest one tells me, I'm really old because I'm not really with it and on TikTok and Snapchat, but all the others, they'll find me.
There you go. And I'll definitely have that in the show notes. So thank you so much for your time today. And thank you for being such a strong advocate for healthy leaders and healthy organizations. The world needs more of us. So I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Breakfast Leadership Show, part of the Breakfast Leadership Network. Visit breakfastleadership.com for tips on empowering your business and your life.